Well, happy data weekender. Thank you all for sticking around to the last session of the SQL Server track and hanging out with me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Deborah Melkin, and we're going to talk today about mastering Dynamic SQL. A little bit more about me. I've been working with databases for a very long time. I started when I was 3. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. Don't do the math. I've mainly been working with SQL Server, but I've done enough with some of the other database platforms so I can do some damage. I mainly work in transactional systems, but I've done enough with some of the analytical systems, just enough so I can do some damage. I'm one of the co-leaders for the data platform Women in Tech user groups. I'm also co-founder of Witspiration, which is a mentoring circle group for mainly focused for women in the data platform. If you have questions about either of those, reach out to me later. I am a Redgate Community Ambassador. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for the data platform. I'm very honored by that. To me, what that means is I love getting up here, making these presentations and talking about databases with all of you and getting that chance to geek out. This is not the important stuff to remember about me. This is the important stuff to remember about me. I'm a longtime member of the alto section of my choir. I do bluegrass jams regularly. I'll be heading over to one later. I've been learning guitar and neglecting a mandolin. I'm kind of a musical theater geek because, yes, that is me with Bernadette Peters after seeing her in a Stephen Sondheim show on Broadway. Oh my God, it was amazing. But yeah, musical theater geek, talk to me later. And for those of you who have been on watching all day, you saw Andy Yoon, my husband, and yes, we like taking geeky pictures of our dog and Sebastian, making him look like he knows what he's doing with computers. All right. That may or may not be why you're here. You're probably here because we're going to talk about Dynamic SQL. So we're going to start off level set. What is Dynamic SQL? My answer to that is those are SQL statements that are created ad hoc and then executed. Simple enough, right? So there we go. We're all mastered. No, we're not. There's a lot of details and nuances to it. And Dynamic SQL actually has a pretty bad reputation. And I get why. Sometimes working with it can be a little complicated, but at the heart of it, we're constructing SQL Server statements. We're constructing those SQL statements on the fly and then executing them. So there's a lot of different nuances to understand to go with that. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a couple use cases, why you may want to do it. We've got to talk about security. We're not going to harp too much on it, but it needs to be mentioned and discussed. We'll talk a little bit about syntax, and then most of this we're going to spend doing demos, and then I'll leave you with a couple of the tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. So use cases. Why would you want to use Dynamic SQL, or what are some of the best cases that I have found over the years for doing Dynamic SQL? The first one, catch-all queries. We have end-user customized queries where the end user wants different things. Variables for things like servers or object names. And an important one that we don't think about often is the delayed parsing of queries. So when we talk about catch-all queries, what is a catch-all query? It's those kitchen sink queries where we try to accomplish everything. So for example, we pass in, 50 parameters, and then our where clause looks something like this, where our column equals the parameter or the parameter is null. And then we have the next one. And usually there are a lot of tables involved. SQL Server right now really doesn't do a great job handling those. So we'll talk about why Dynamic SQL is a good use case for this. End user customized queries. This is a real world example. I had worked at a company once where we had this need. So we have an application with screens, and the data we display is going to depend on what the client chooses. For example, we're going to use a car dealership for our demos today. So dealership A wants a VIN number, the true cost of the car, and an invoice price. The second dealership wants the VIN number, but they want the base model name, the package name, and the MSRP. Now, where these columns are could be on different tables. Maybe they all are on the same table, but we don't want to pull back everything and then figure out what the data is. We just want to pull back the data we need because that's how SQL is efficient. So Dynamic SQL is one way we can do this. Variables for static info. That title's a little weird. I'll fix it at some point. But essentially, we need to have something variable. But the way it's used in the SQL, it cannot accept a variable. So, for example, a database name. I need to do a cross-database join. So select from our database name the inventory table. Well, we can't really write it like that. So we're going to have to use Dynamic SQL to create that statement so that way that database, we can be a little more dynamic with it. And delayed parsing. This is something I had to do all the time because I would have the same scripts that I would use to update my database as I would use for inserting, or that update script is going to be run multiple times because each version we just add to the end. So by delaying parsing, what it means is when SQL Server gets a statement, it parses the statement to figure out if it can actually run the statement, and then it'll actually do all the things it needs to do to run the statement. Sometimes we don't want it to parse before it actually runs. We may want to delay it for a number of reasons. And delayed parsing allows us to do that. For example, I'm selecting from a table. Later, I'm going to drop the column. And the next time I run that select statement, that column isn't there. So nothing is going to be able to be run because SQL is going to say, oh, sorry, this column doesn't exist. I can't do this. So we can use Dynamic SQL to say, hey, don't worry about whether that column's here or not. Just we're going to do something dynamic here. And then when it runs that Dynamic SQL, then it can do its job of parsing to say, hey, is everything here? Can I actually run this? All right, security and vulnerabilities. This is why people don't like Dynamic SQL. Why? Oh, hey, look, it's little Bobby tables. Yay! This is why people don't like Dynamic SQL, because it really does make your code vulnerable for SQL injection. What we mean by SQL injection, someone putting statements, destructive statements that allows them to do things like, drop a database, drop a table, find out other information, select from other pieces of information that they don't have access to. It's a workaround to do destructive things and bypass permissions. It's a bad thing. We really need to make sure that everything we pass to our dynamic SQL statements, we can make it we need to remove those aspects and wait for people to put bad code in and do things that they shouldn't do. Sanitize our variables, really protect what we're doing for table names and object names along the way, so they can't do things like little Bobby tables. All right. Syntax. There are a couple different ways we can do it. There's really one main way that we'll see it, but there are kind of three different ways that you can write this. The first one is saying exec, and add SQL is representing our SQL statement. So just execute our dynamic SQL statement. Pretty straightforward. The next one is exec sp execute SQL, and then our statement. This is pretty flexible because not only is it's doing what we have before, but we also start expanding upon it and allowing for parameters to be passed in and out of the statement. So we have this vast range of flexibility that's built into using SP execute SQL. And there's a third way. It's not documented. It's not officially supported. It's MS for each database. And what this does is takes that SQL statement and runs it against all of your databases. There is a wrapper that Aaron Bertrand had written that kind of puts it on it, makes it a little more flexible. But again, it's still based on something that's not documented or officially supported. Of these three, we're going to spend most of our time with SP execute SQL. It is generally considered best practice to use this form of it. It can do the MS for each database if you want, but this is really what you want to stick with when we're doing dynamic SQL. All right, so we can continue to talk about it, or we can just jump straight over to the demos. So let's go do that. All right. I had mentioned that we're going to use our auto dealership demo database. So we're going to stick with that. I'm going to make sure I have my execution plans turned on so we can kind of get a little bit sense what's going on behind the scene. I'm adding a little bit of explanation here. You will notice I use nvarchar max a lot with what I'm doing. I'll throw my code or whatever dynamic SQL statement I create, I put it in a parameter that's nvarchar max. I know what you're thinking, Deborah. Shouldn't you use just the size data that you need? Don't just make everything nvarchar max. nvarchar max. Yeah. I know, but there are reasons for it, and it's not just me being lazy. Um, First of all, I mentioned SP execute SQL. We're going to be using that. The parameter you pass to it, it's Unicode. It needs to be nvarchar. The other reason I like Max is I've done some bad things with Dynamic SQL over the years. I've written some really, really long code. Let me tell you, the reason I can tell you that a print statement is only 4,000 characters is because I've had to print some of the Dynamic SQL statements that I've created, and they're longer than 4,000 lines of characters, or 4,000 characters. In fact, some of them have been more than 8,000 characters. I may have done more than 12,000 characters, but there's a reason I know this, and it's because I've written some really, really, really lengthy dynamic SQL. In fact, part of the reason I came up with this session is I realized I'd probably been spending about a year or two on projects where everything I had to write in dynamic SQL. I was using it that extensively for these projects. So I've done a couple things. And what I've determined is there's so much stuff where I don't know the length of the statements I'm creating for a lot of these. So I go with nvarchar max. If you know that what you're doing is going to be within a certain range, please do that. Obviously, that's good practice. When I write dynamic SQL, I just don't know, so I tend to do nvarchar max. Here's the other fun thing with varchar max. It works because the size of a string is limited to 2 gigs on the 64-bit server. So maximum size of nvarchar max, it all works, and hitting those limitations. So now that I've spent more time talking about that than I intended to, let's keep moving on to our examples. So the first thing, I'm going to do a quick comparison of exec versus SP execute SQL. So putting in my parameter, a very simple statement, select initial test. We're going to exec and then call our store procedure. Both ways we're doing dynamic SQL. And if we look, it's returning initial test because that's what I told it to select. I did turn on my execution plans, but because this is it's just a select statement, there's no execution plan. That's fine. So let's change that and get some going. So I'm just going to select top 10 from my inventory table. It's pretty much the same, 10 records from each. And if I go to my execution plan, let's zoom in a little. Zoom, it's playing nice. All right, we can see select 10. It is the same query, and it's pretty much the same. And in fact, these will be the same if I go to, let me look at my properties here. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to look at my query hash. So what we're doing, my query hash and query plan hash. So SQL Server takes it, figures out what the query is. D443, D57. So just kind of getting an idea of those. I don't need to be exact, but if I go back here and then go back to my properties, we can see that it's actually the same exact query that's executed. So it's everything is the same. All right. Key. All right. So what if we want to do this same query, but different table? So this is that we have an object name, but we need to vary the object. Maybe I want to be able to run this, but I don't want to run this just for inventory. Maybe at some point I'm going to want to do this for other things. So we know we can't do select top 10 from the variable directly. One way, if I were to do exec, I could say select top 10 from, and then I add the variable name. I could do this for exec statement. Doesn't work quite the same for SP execute SQL, so I want to keep everything the same. So this is where I'm going to create my variable, put everything in. I'm going to print it so you can see what I'm doing. And then we can run the execute for both of these. And we can see it's running the exact same thing. My message, we can see what my statement is that I'm sending to both of them. And again, we can see that select top 10 from inventory, select top 10 from inventory. It's the same statement that's executed. We know it just ran the same thing 2 different ways. Now we're talking about an object. So now this is where we start leading into wanting to pay attention to security. So let's try to break this. I'm going to try to inject some SQL in here. And I'm going to be nice. I'm just going to do a select statement, letting us know that we did a bad thing. I'm based in Boston, so we're going to add a statement, print it here, our statement looks like. So I'm going to run this. Boston, we have a problem both times. We look at our messages. We can see that what we put together, we were able to do. Select top 10 from, we gave it the parameter of inventory. That's what we wanted. But because we threw the semicolon, we're easily to saying, hey, here's a second statement that we want as well. Honestly, I probably didn't even need the semicolon, but again, to kind of prove the point of we can do these sort of things and we can create issues. So how do we prevent this problem? How about square brackets? Because if you put brackets around something, that means that anything in between those square brackets is an object, and we will treat that as a singular object. So when I'm done with this, I'm going to say select top 10 from my table variable with the brackets around it, right? So now I'm saying everything in here is a bracket. That should work, right? Well, let's take a look. What's it going to do? Because in my statement, I've seen the code and I'm still a bad person. I'm going to put something in there. I know they put the brackets around everything, so I'm just going to put this here. And I'm going to make sure that when I still have a result, because I know the brackets are in the code around it this way, I just need to make sure I have another open bracket at the end, so when I finish the statement, everything's going to look clean. So what happens when I run all of this? Oh, I still can do that. And when we look at the execution and we look at the message, our statement that was created, it figured out that inventory is a quote name. It's square brackets. It knows that's all one object. But because of the way the statement was created and it was put inside here, it still figured out that it was 2 separate statements. It didn't take my table variable, or the variable called table, to be clear, and didn't understand I wanted to treat that all as one. So I'm still able to do SQL injection this way. And the thing is, I used to do this all the time thinking it was safe. And now I want to go back to past me and past companies go, sorry, y'all, because I'm still able to break this. The solution is called quote name. So this is a built-in function. And I'm sending the same statement we did before, but now I'm doing a quote name around my variable. And what happens here? I get an error. Because now what it's doing is it's taking everything inside the variable and treating it as one statement. This is how, when you do quote name, you can do some funky stuff with your object names. You can put emojis in there and all sorts of fun things. And the square brackets allow you to treat everything as one. What this quote name function says, everything in here I'm going to treat as one. So that's how this interprets that quote name. And it's interpreting this whole thing to say, to treat as one. And you can kind of see it in here as well, because we're getting that printout of what quote name does. You can see that it put 2 square brackets around inventory because it's kind of creating that escape for the square bracket that is inside the variable. So it understands that all of this is supposed to be treated as one. And so then everything in here, this is still one single statement. And that's why we're getting that error. I tried a lot of different ways to break this as I was coming up with this demo, and I really couldn't do it using quote name. Play with it. Like I said, I couldn't break it. It made it much safer and a nice way to sanitize your variables and really making sure that you can't allow things that aren't supposed to go in your code to get there. a lot of the Dynamic SQL I've been working with recently, everything is around database names and object names. And so being able to use quote names, so I know that I'm really making sure that I'm just getting that variable or that object name correctly and nothing else could happen. I really made sure that I stuck to that principle. Just not that I thought that anyone could break into the code the way I was creating the Dynamic SQL, but just as that added insurance that I was using best practices with Dynamic SQL. It's the one time I like square brackets, using quote names in Dynamic SQL. So definitely make sure you keep your SQL and your variables, making sure you're sanitizing so people can't do bad things in them. No little Bobby tables. All right. So another thing I want to move into another thing. Like I said, right now I'm going to spend a little time doing with some of the nuances with Dynamic SQL because I think these are things we haven't really paid attention to, and there's some really interesting stuff. One of the big ones that I started dealing with had to do with the relation of Dynamic SQL to the batch that it's running in. So I'm going to run a couple things here all at once so we can see. One, I'm going to get the session ID from the page that I'm on right now from this demo script. Then I'm going to run my Dynamic SQL using both SB execute SQL and just execing that SQL statement. And then I'm actually going to run XB command shell so I can get it from the command line. And these are kind of important things to kind of recognize. So from my batch, my session ID is 84. From within my Dynamic SQL statements, both of them, it's 84. I'm now part of the same session ID. That's really important. We'll take advantage of that later. But taking that as opposed to using XP command shell, my session ID is 73. So I'm in a different session. Not thinking about command shell too much, XP command shell, but it's understanding that XP command shell, everything is outside of the session that we're dealing in. So for example, if you wanted to deal with temp tables and you're pulling something out of XP command shell, you actually need to deal with a global temp table. So your session from command shell, something different, can see it. But our Dynamic SQL is in the same session as our outer batch. Well, what does that mean? That's got some really cool implications, like with temp tables. So this temp table shouldn't be here already. So I'm just going to create a very basic example. I have an identity and a sample value. So I'm going to create this temp table. So normally the way I think of doing things is I need to take data from my Dynamic SQL statement and store it in a temp table for a number of reasons. So normally what I would do is I take my statement, and then I would use something like exec SB execute SQL and insert it into my dynamic statement. One thing I'm going to show quickly that I think is really important that we haven't done yet is I want to show you my estimated execution plan. And if I do this, we can see that the way it interprets or way its SQL Server thinks it's going to work, it's going to insert into my dynamic statement. Notice exec SB execute SQL. So it's dealing with as a stored procedure. This is going to come back to us later, but it's two separate things that we're doing and two separate statements. When I run this, we can see that I'm able to insert directly into my temp table. And my execution plan is now we have the insert into test, and it's still the execute SB execute SQL. It's still doing it from the store procedure statement. So now, knowing that my Dynamic SQL is in the same session, whatever I'm executing from here is in the same session as my temp table, it means I can also think of doing it this way, where my statement is all together as one. I'm inserting into my dynamic statement is inserting into the temp table from that test value. So what happens when I run this? That's weird. There we go. Let's do that again. That still worked. Not sure where that error came from. All right, my execution plan. Well, I have something a little different now. insert into my temp table, select from my dynamic SQL statement. So it kind of changes what I'm actually executing. And my execution plan is a little different too, because it's not that stored procedure. It's not in some little black box, but I can actually see my insert statement here as to what it's doing. But I'm able to do that temp table from within my dynamic SQL statement because it's all part of the session. And so I'm able to see everything, all part of that as one. This trick is actually comes into play a little bit later, and realizing that the dynamic SQL statement is still part of that batch allows me to do a lot more flexibility when I think about how am I writing my dynamic SQL statements. So let's play on this theme a little bit more. So we know we can see a local temp table from within our dynamic SQL statement. And so let's go here and let's look at our parameters. What does it mean for parameters and variables? So the first one is I'm going to pass in parameters. So we were talking about earlier SP execute SQL, how more flexible it is. So I'm going to take this first statement and run it here. And I'm just going to do the exec at SQL. I want my SQL statement, I want to be able to filter based on a parameter. My parameter is the base model ID. I'm writing my SQL statement, select top 10 from inventory where base model equals my variable. And if I were to run this, I can't do that. So my variable is outside my dynamic SQL statement. Exec, it's still part of the same session, but it's not recognizing my local variable. It doesn't do that by default. So because I don't have it, I can't use exec at SQL and use that local variable. If I'm using exec SQL, what I have to do is I have to modify things and modify my statement. I've got an integer variable, so I have to convert it so I can add it to my statement, and then I can run it. But with SP execute SQL, think of it almost like a stored procedure. I'm able to pass a variable into it. So what I'm doing is it's almost an ad hoc stored procedure if you want to think of it that way. So I'm saying my statement, which is this same statement we saw earlier at base model. Now what I get to do is I now get to say, hey, what are the variables that I need in my statement? And I can pass that variable from my session and pass it straight in, my local variable, and pass it in. And now we can see that this is also where we start seeing a little bit differences between what we mean by what we're able to do with exec SQL and SP execute SQL, because in the end, well, the results are the same and the query plan is going to be the same. We're actually doing two different things. So if we zoom in here, select top 10 from inventory where base model equals 58. Because I can't pass a parameter to that exec statement, I have to hard code it in. So I now base model equals 58. For my second statement, SP execute SQL, I'm passing in a variable. It's already parameterized. So this goes into how are we caching our queries and procedure cache and those sort of fun things. Auto parameterization of statements, all of that. Because equals 58 is different from equal at variable. We now have two different plans. Not necessarily a problem, but we have changed our statements and what we're passing in is different. Now, this also means that we get to start having some more fun as we have multiple parameters. So same statement we had before. Let me hide this a little. So now we can see that in order to do 2 for at SQL, I've got to convert 2 different parameters now that I have 2. For SP execute SQL, I just declare, hey, I've got 2 parameters and pass both in. So what happens when I run these two multiple parameters? They both run. And again, our statements are a little different where base model equals 58, package ID is 4 versus base model ID equals at base model ID and package equals at package ID. All right. Now, one thing I want to kind of note is while I'm keeping these the same, they don't have to be the same. For example, new base model ID, I'm going to pass that in here. New package ID in here. This the parameters that you declare here for SP execute SQL, they still need to match what you have in your statement. However, what you're passing in doesn't. So if I run this, it still runs because I didn't change what I'm passing in. The parameter name has changed, but it's still going to the same match that we have here. And it just to kind of show that the order still matters, what happens if I put new package ID first and new base ID first? We get different results. Why? Because I'm passing 4 for my base model value and 58 as my new package ID. So I've changed it. So the order that you pass things in has to match the order when you have multiple parameters, but they don't have to be the exact same names in order for that to work. I'm talking about using SP execute SQL as a store procedure. This also means that you have the concept of output parameters too. So output parameters, let's say we want to get a total count for base model of 58. Again, this isn't going to work if I use exec SP execute, just the exec at SQL statement, select at count. It's not going to recognize this. So we have to do things like maybe create a table variable or a temp table, and then insert from here. Yeah, I'm just not a fan of this because now I've got a table result. I don't want a table. I just want my variable. I want to and go from there. I created a table variable, y'all. Temp tables, but even still, temp tables to get one value. It seems rather excessive. So we can do SP execute SQL here, and this is now where we can use that output parameter. And again, just like we create for store procedures, we have our variable, and then we have our parameter, our output parameter, and we do the same thing here, our parameter, our variable, and our output variable, so we can receive that value. And so now I can do this, and I'm just able to declare a variable and get that information. So I see a quick question here in the chat. Do we get text and code issues when a variable has single quotes in it? I'm assuming this means when we start using quote name and when we're passing in different data to our variable. Because everything has to be quoted and you're putting everything in a variable, yes, you're going to want to make sure that you're dealing with things like if something's supposed to be a single quote, putting the two quotes together to make sure that you're passing the data correctly to the variable. All of those rules of what you need to do to your date to put it in a variable applies. I may have an example of that later. Let's double check because I think date time's a really good example of that sort of thing. But yeah, you're going to want to make sure like escape characters and those sort of things are handled when you create the variable. So we'll talk a little more about that. Hopefully that answers your initial question. So the next thing for content, so hopefully getting back to what we've talked about local variables. And hopefully that makes sense in terms of what this means for how we're passing data to our dynamic SQL statements. The next one I want to deal with in terms of context and still making sure we understand that is what happens when we change database inside the context of a dynamic SQL statement. For example, we've been using our auto dealership demo database. I've got another database here called superheroes. So what happens if I want to pull something from my superheroes database from my dynamic SQL statement? So let's do a very simple example of that. Select database name before. Inside my dynamic SQL statement, I'm going to switch databases, and then I'm going to select it after we're done. All right, so we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but we can see right here, before we run the statement, we're in auto dealership demo. Inside the dynamic SQL statement, we're in superheroes. And then afterwards, it didn't change the outer version of our store procedure. So even though we're in that same session, it's not the same if use database, change the database, and then it's still afterwards. That use database is going to stay for that context of our dynamic SQL statement. So this is where we're starting to get that shift. While we may still be in that same session, the context that we're dealing with from within our dynamic SQL statement starts to change a little. It's not quite a black box because when we execute that statement, we still see everything in execution plans. We can still see what everything's doing. However, we're getting a ton of change in context of everything that works in, that we've put in that batch for that dynamic SQL statement. One of the things that you'll notice, there are some things you can't do with dynamic SQL, and that's things like using the word go, because everything needs to be treated as a batch. It's a single batch. Go is 2 different batches. Again, this is where we're starting to see where things change a little bit. So it's in the context of this, well, we're in the same session ID, but the context of those statements are starting to change. The next place that we're really going to start seeing that is, what does it mean for transactions? So if I've got a transaction going on, what does it mean for the data inside my transaction? All right, so here's how we're going to test that. I'm going to begin with a transaction outside my dynamic SQL statement. I'm going to do a select statement. I'm going to just double check open tran, see if there's anything there. Do the select within from same thing, dbcc tran from within my dynamic SQL statement. Open tran doesn't really show anything if you don't have any locks. Like a select statement tends to not really show anything from my experience, but this DMV tran active transactions, that will always show it. So what we're going to do is we're just going to run all of this together. Create a transaction here. So first we've done is we've run our select statement. If I go to messages, oh, I actually do see some transactions going. I see my transaction outside. We see that some work is being done. This is why I like naming transactions when I run these. And we can see that same thing was run twice. Once from outside our transaction or outside our dynamic SQL, once from within our dynamic SQL. And if we go back to our results, again, we can see here 2 sets of the dynamic transactions that statement's going transaction outside, transaction outside. So we can see that there's a transaction going on here from this session. All right. Now what happens if we do it from inside, same demo, except for I'm going to declare the transaction from within the dynamic SQL statement? Am I going to see that open transaction outside? Is it all part of this? So I'm just going to begin the transaction here, top 10. We're going to do the open tran and then roll back from the inside. See if we can see that open transaction and stuff. And wait a minute, I got an error here. Transaction count after execute indicates a mismatching number of begin and commit statement. Well, that's weird. I mean, we see that the transaction started because we see it here and we ran this outside of that statement. So what's this error? Well, this error comes from the fact that I had to do a little digging. Erlen Sommerskogs has a great blog post that really gets into things, but it's all getting into nested transactions. So because we're running dynamic SQL, we're getting a different tran we're actually getting a different nest level. And when you begin a transaction and you end a transaction, you have to be at the same nesting level. Nested transactions, this gets really complicated, but we have to make sure we're at the same nesting level as each. So let me show you this. It's easier to show what I mean. So right now, I'm going to look at the transaction count, my transaction count, and I'm looking at my nested level. So I'm running this outside of the batch. We're starting at 0. When I run my dynamic SQL statement, so from SP execute SQL, I'm going to run the same thing, but I'm starting inside SP execute SQL, my number of open transactions and my nest level. I'm going to start a transaction, check again, roll it back, and check again. So what am I seeing here? So before I start the transaction, I have my tran count is 0. I have no open transactions. But notice this nest level. So we are using SP execute SQL, we are two nested levels inside. So the first is our session, then we have SP execute SQL, and then we have our actual statement, 0, 1, 2. That's why we're at 2. When I start the transaction, I'm at 1. And then, whoops, let me zoom out because Zoom it's really weird with Teams. Inside, and then when I'm done, it's back to 0, but it's 2. So what happened, why I got that error previously, is when I did the transaction inside my Dynamic SQL, and then I tried to roll it back afterwards, well, it didn't matter because I was at a different tran count at that point, that different nest level. And because I didn't complete my transaction and tried to deal with it later, it said, sorry, I'm at a different nest level. I can't do that. So everything has to be the same. So the short answer is, if you're going, whenever you're using to begin your transaction, commit it or roll back within that same thing. So if you're doing it within your Dynamic SQL statement, start your transaction within your Dynamic statement and roll it back after it. It all needs to be encapsulated in your Dynamic SQL statement, which goes back to, keep those short and sweet. Make sure you know what you're doing with transactions. But it all needs to be done within, if you're going to do transactions in your Dynamic SQL statement, it needs to be completed and rolled back from within that statement as well. It's a weird quirk, but it is kind of one of those things where transactions are hard to deal with. If you're doing explicit transactions, even more difficult and more important to pay attention to what you're doing. Similar thing with if you have the exec statement here as well. I'm just going to, let's see, I'm not starting the transaction, but just so you can kind of see nesting level with exec at SQL, it's actually 1, not the 2 with SP execute SQL. It's a little quirk, but even still, you have the same problem with transactions. If you're opening it inside Dynamic SQL, close it within that same statement. All right, any questions about that? I'm double checking chat. I don't see any new questions. All right, I'm gonna take a quick breath of water. All right. Just a quick example, I mentioned that there's the MS for each database. So if I wanted to take the same statement, run against all my databases, what you're seeing here is how I would do it normally. And this is what I tend to do, create a cursor against my databases that aren't system databases, fetch it from a cursor, run my statement using quote name, run everything, go from there. Or I could use MS for each database and do the logic here. This question mark, it'll figure out for me. I have to add extra logic if I'm using Microsoft's version of it to say I don't want any system databases included. It'll get slightly different orders. I just wanted to show a quick side-by-side example. Yeah, this is cleaner, but this is really specific. I need to run it against everything. So I don't find it as useful. I tend to stick with a longer version up here when I've had to do it. So I want to move along quickly to delayed parsing. I use this for upgrades all the time. I've had multiple different versions, and I'm so used to using migration scripts that delayed parsing has kind of become my best friend. So what do I mean? I have an upgrade statement here, and I need to run the same statement, and I need to make it idempotent, which means anytime I run this whole script, I need to make sure it runs without fail, and I don't cause any problems going forward. So using my auto dealership demo database, create Dynamic SQL. So I have to create a new schema. Well, create schema has to be the only statement in the batch. You can't use it with if exists to check. And you can tell that I've already run it. I'm getting the tooltip here from Management Studio. Creating a table. Right now I'm doing drop this column. Well, you can see I've already run this because I've already dropped this column at some point. The next version, oh, look, that's where I have the statement to drop this column. So we can already see parsing, hey, I've got issues. And then we have a thing where I didn't name my constraint earlier. I need to go fix that. I've got a formula for it. So now I need to go identify the primary key constraints and manually create those statements to do it. No one wants to do that. So this is a script that I would create instead. use same thing, but now I can do things where I can now check, do I need to create something for this schema before? And now I can use my Dynamic SQL to delay the parsing and say, create schema. We know it's in its own batch. We've already kind of seen that context earlier. So now we've created its own batch, create schema. This is not going to error out. Again, we know I already had my check earlier, so we know that's fine. But now we can do say, hey, does this column exist? If this column exists, then run this statement. It's not going to give me a parsing error, because if I just did select this statement with a select, it would still say, hey, I need to look for drop this column, even though I've got a check to say, don't run this statement if it doesn't exist. It still has to run that select statement to say, hey, is this statement valid? Delayed parsing means I don't have that problem. Dropping the column, this was the same, but now we can do things for like, hey, I need to rename something. So now I can go through and dynamically rename whatever I need to rename. So if I were to run this, let's see what errors I get. Oh, look, all sorts of errors. The original. Now with our delayed parsing, no errors. No one's going to call me and say, hey, Deborah, what's this problem on upgrade? So that's a quick way to say, hey, this is that delayed parsing. Everything works. We know things would fail the first time, but now we can say, don't parse it until I need you to, and then it works. I see there's a question. Can you describe why temp tables are not visible if created inside SP execute SQL? I'm going to come back to that one. I want to take a look at that text later, so we can figure that one out. Because that's a good question. I want to play with that one. All right. Let's see if there's any other questions before I continue, and I don't see any. All right. So we've gone over the behavior, we've gone over delayed parsing. So now let's talk about error handling, because you can absolutely do error handling with Dynamic SQL. So we're going to create a temp table, person table. We're going to use this later, so I'm going to go ahead and create that now. So one of the problems that I started having with Dynamic SQL was error handling. And this is actually based off some of the examples that I had. I was using open row set and I was inserting into temp tables. And the problem that I kept having was I was inserting to my table and my open row set that was being done dynamically, as kind of this example you're seeing here, I wasn't capturing the errors. This is why knowing that the temp table is visible from within your Dynamic SQL statement, knowing that you can see the one created outside, knowing that combination was there, that actually got me around the error. I was having a weird double hop network error. I wish I could recreate that here, but I'm just not smart enough to figure that out. But I kind of want to show you, thinking about the different ways that we're putting our statements together and the way we can do some of these error handlings, want to kind of show how that works. So this one is, I'm doing an open row set to a server that exists. So we can see that I'm able to select everything just fine. I'm selecting from my superheroes database. So now I'm going to do something and select from a server that doesn't exist. I don't have a server named Chihuahua. Sebastian is still a little, unhappy with me for that one since he's mostly Chihuahua, but we just don't have that instance set up. So it takes a couple seconds and we're going to get a failure on this one because open row set takes a bit, and look, it can't find that SQL server. All right, so is there a nicer way to handle this? Sure. We've got our begin, try, end try, and then we can do the catch. So again, a couple of more awkward seconds. Let's see if we can get that going. One of the comments, love the last line from the DBCC statements. You can find permissions, requires memberships. Usually means if you get that error, you can look in the mirror and start talking to yourself. Yep, go fix it with the administrator. You don't have permissions. I've had that one before. All right. So we waited a bit, we caught the error cannot access. So now we're saying that when you run something through Dynamic SQL, depending on the statement that you're doing, it can catch an error and it can handle it nicely. So now we're going to add that temp table, and now we can start doing things like inserting into person that temp table, that execute statement. Going to take a couple of seconds here because we're running from a server that doesn't exist. Now, this is where I started noticing the problem. Remember earlier, I showed you that statement, insert into temp table, execute from the stored procedure, SP execute SQL. We saw that the parsing was done pretty much as two statements. So now we're getting into the issue as we're trying to troubleshoot, which error are we troubleshooting? We don't have a server. We're error running statement here, we got a select statement, could not open a connection. So we're able to catch it nicely. You have to be careful and know some of the ins and outs of what errors can be caught. This one we're able to catch nicely. It's the same error as before. And if we were to run this a different way and do that insert into the temp table, this one we're still going to be able to catch nicely, but being able to move that temp table, that insert into my select statement, I was able to catch it because it was able to parse everything as one statement. We saw that with the plan that we looked at earlier, moving that insert into temp table and made it part of the dynamic SQL statement. It changed what we were trying to parse, and it changed what the error was, so we were able to catch it differently. Like I said, the double hot network issue I had that made me think of it isn't here. I actually have a blog post on it, just kind of explaining it a little more. But it is paying attention to what you catch, what begin, which the try catch in SQL Server can handle, and what it can't handle. It's a little tricky, but knowing you can still write it properly, and if you write the dynamic SQL statement properly, you can catch the errors that you'd like and as you want to. All right, for interest of time, I'm going to move on to the next one, which is kind of the catch-all query, because this is what we tend to do all the time. I'm going to go ahead and run this. So I've got two store procedures, search all sold inventory, and then I'm writing it as dynamic. And I'm adding a parameter here, debug. So let me explain that while this one runs. So this one, whoops, this is the full store procedure, search all sold inventory. And we can see that this is a kitchen sink query. Look at all these inner joins and then this funky where clause where is it there, is it not? We have to do different decisions. Oh, hey, we have to handle things if values are null. If they're not null, is that really what we wanted to do? Hey, we have to deal with date received. So all of these different things, SQL Server, the more confusing it is for you to read it, I find SQL Server has the same problems as it tries to parse everything and put it together a good plan. I've dealt with stuff where we have all of these tables, half of them will be left joins, and we'll have another 10 tables which are left joins that are only there for the where clause in case we need the data, but we never select anything from it at all. So these can be really big and nasty and a lot of fun. So what I did is I started creating a dynamic SQL version of this. So this is where we can get things the way we need it and really tune that query to be just what we want. So it's only selecting what we need. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm creating a list of parameters so I can take all of this stuff and pass it in. Then what I can do is I can create my statement. I'll show you why I'm doing this here. I'm actually putting the name of the store proc within the dynamic SQL statement. Because everything was interjoined, I need to keep that there. And here's where we start making things dynamic. This is a constant that's a pattern that people like to do just because they find it makes it easier if they had to add things on. What if you don't have a where clause? How do you want to handle it? It can get a little messy, but to always say where 1 equals 1 can help sometimes create dynamic SQL statements. But now we can do things like say, hey, if I actually have a value that I care about, then I can add my statement here. And the same thing for model name and all of these different variances. So if there's something that makes sense, then I can add what I need to add. Someone was asking earlier about whether you needed to deal with quotes and how you're dealing with dealing with different texts that you want to deal with. For dates, because I'm hard coding my standards, it's a date time. It'll interpret as one when we run it, but in order to make it go into the variable, you have to use the two quotes together. So I'm able to now create my statement. For debugging, I like this. This is my favorite tip. I put a parameter here to say, hey, what am I doing if I'm running this? Generate a SQL statement. So now I can see what my statement looks like together so I can put it all, and then I can able to then run my dynamic SQL statement as part of it. So if I go back to my original thing now, we can now see that those statements have run. And my execution plans, this first one, we can see that we can see our statement here. But we can also see I've got a slightly different plan because of what I'm passing in. My where clause, 1 equals 1, well, I didn't pass any parameters. So now I have a different query that I'm pulling back. I'm not forcing all of those where clause and all the logic with the where clause. I'm just saying, hey, pull this all back together. I want to pull back everything. This starts making a difference when you do start having different values. For example, I just want to see one value here. So for the original one, my statement is going to pull back everything. I still have to do those searches and some of those filters. This is what I had before. And now we can look at my where clause here, and it's and color equals color name. I just need to search on color name. I don't care about all of that other logic that is still up here in this statement. I don't need to do all of that extra work. So this is one reason why you may want to use the kitchen sink not have the kitchen sink version, but you're really able to modify that SQL statement just for what you need, which is what we're always saying to do. And you can do the same thing even if you have multiple statements. I've got debug on here, so you can actually see what happens. I've got my statement, so I can see the exact select statement that's being run. Is this what I want to see? Now this will matter. Now I mentioned earlier that I put the store procedure here. And this is getting into some of the details that we're seeing that I was showing earlier about some of the context that you work with Dynamic SQL. Well, it's still part of the same session. There's a little bit of the context that it gets executed in that's a little different. And we can start seeing this when we start doing things like looking at query store, because now we want to look for the object. I've run a bunch of different statements over time, but we can see that that search all sold inventory, we've seen that I've run it because the object name is here. But we can also see that that statement, the SQL text here, this is my dynamic SQL statement. We know it was run through the store procedure, but it's not connected with the object name. So this is one of the reasons why I recommend if you're doing this from a store procedure, putting some context in or building it in your dynamic SQL statement someplace so you can search for it later, because it's not going to appear with the object in query store when you go to troubleshoot these statements later. What you will want to do is this is where you can do things like extended events, and those will help you. I've been running a session along, so hopefully this will take a couple extra seconds to kind of pull back. So I've been running extended events, and whoops, it says it was started. Let's see if I can, hopefully this worked properly, and I've been collecting all along. For some reason it's not, but what you can do is you can see that there'll be SQL. I thought I had started it earlier, clearly it stopped. But what you can see is you can use this to get that information. I'm not sure why I'm not seeing all my statements. I thought I was running everything, but using extended events, you'll be able to see the order. You just won't be able to associate that dynamic SQL statement with your object, but you can still look at everything that was executed, see it in order, and be able to figure it out. Again, for query store, as I was saying earlier, this is why you should put something about where it's coming from, that dynamic SQL is coming from, so you can go back to it and search later. Because at this point, what you're troubleshooting is that generated SQL statement. And that's what you're going to be tuning for. You may want to tune how you create the statement as well, but part of the reason you're creating it is because you want to tune the results of it. So make sure that you're keeping that there as well. All right, I'm coming near to the end of time. Let me see if there's other statements. I'm looking at this text here. Can you describe why temp tables are not visible if created inside those statements? So you have an example of creating, I'm copying the text here because I'm really curious about this. Sorry. Copy. So if you're creating this, you're not able to select. Right now, this is probably a parse error because you've created within the exec statement. So you're not. So my guess, if you executed these independently, you would be able to do it. But remember, we haven't run this yet. Right now, it's saying it doesn't exist because it has been parsed. But if I run exec here and then run here, it's not creating. If I run here, my guess is that it's different context, so we're not able to do it. And this one, see here, because this needs to be temp DB. Select top one object. So it's running, but it's still just not able to do it. I'm not sure why it's not creating. My guess it's in a different context. And so we're not able to see it from that purpose. My guess if you were able to create it as a global, we would. But this is where there's some of that difference between where the context of where Dynamic SQL is being executed, that it's not creating from here. I have not played with this yet, but that's a really cool find. So thank you very much for sharing that. And now I'm going to go play with that later because but I'm going to say that's probably because this is considered a different context than what we're seeing from the outside. I don't know if it means it's only if it thinks it's a batch or why that is, but that's where I'm going to go. So thank you for sharing that. All right. Any other questions? All right. So let me wrap this up. I'm a couple minutes over. So tips and tricks at debug for your proc. So if you're doing that, it's a great way to troubleshoot and see what exactly you're executing. You can log it later too as well. It's really useful information. Validate your parameters. Use quote names for objects to really make sure you're encapsulating code and not allowing SQL injection. Add error handling just like you would anything else. And then your performance tune your created statement. That's why you do debug, so you can print out your statement, because essentially in the end, you're just creating different versions of the SQL that's being run. We're always optimizing the SQL that's being run, so make sure you're going to treat that like you would everything else. Best practices apply. I have a lot of different resources. There's a great article by Tara Kaiser, Exec versus SP Execute SQL. Use SP Execute SQL. These three are all about that for each DB unsupported proc and the extension that Aaron Bertrand made. Erlen Sommerskog has all the error handling resources, talking about Dynamic SQL, error handling. Great information. Ken Fisher also has a session on Dynamic SQL that was really great as well. We've got my 2 blog posts that help inspire this session as well. And of course, Microsoft documentation, just so the ins and outs of SP Execute SQL. And with that, if you have more questions, feel free to reach out. Email. My blog is debthedba.wordpress. GitHub is where you can find the demos and the presentation. I have a couple changes I will be uploading later, but you can still find the presentation. All of the stuff is there as well. I'm also on socials, mostly Blue Sky, a little bit Mastodon. So you can find me there. Reach out if you have anything else. And with that, thank you so much for coming. I know it's been a long day of learning if you've been on since the very beginning of Date a Weekender. Thank you so much for having me. And any last questions?
So Arno has his hand up, so I don't know if that is a question, but I was going to say so you mentioned that Erlen's, so funny enough, that was his talk earlier. So he was doing that within his session, like as if as if it was all planned. So when we do publish the videos at some point in the next couple of weeks, that is his talk. So there we go.
Yeah, he has a lot of great information on error handling. So
Yeah,
I'm sure
great
that's
stuff.
great.